But for now, I'd like to introduce the last speaker of this session, who is Giovanna Frene. Giovanna Frene is a poet and scholar and was discovered in 1994 by Andrea Zanzotto himself, with whom she had a long friendship. She graduated in literature at the University of Padua with a thesis on the young Zanzotto, which was then published both in Studi Novecenteschi and partially in a volume by the Cini Foundation of Venice. She's got a PhD in history of the Italian language at Padua with Pier Vincenzo Mengaldo, where she worked on Metastasio, and she's also working on Metastasio in her current PhD at Lausanne under the supervision of Professor Lorenzo Tomasin. Her poetry is published in several journals and books. I shall mention in the circumstances only Datità, with a note by Andrea Zanzotto, first published by Manni in 2001 and then republished by Arcipelago Itico in 2018. As a scholar, she published on 18th and 20th century writers such as Metastasio, Zanzotto, Arboni, Cucchi, Cecchinel, and many poets of the new generation on Studi Novecento, Lingua Stile, Paragone, and she has collaborated with Alfa Beta 2, Antinomia, Poetarum Silvia, and Semicerchio. Today, Giovanna Frene will talk about the landscape mind for an eco-geographic interpretation of Andrea Zanzotto. Giovanna, the floor is yours.
Buongiorno a tutti. Mi sentite?
Yeah.
Scusate il ritardo, io sono arrivata da scuola prima. Mi spiace aver perso l'inizio anche di Stefano e un po' di cose, ma devo fare i salti mortali, come si dice. Allora, 70 years after the publication of Dietro paesaggio, landscape is still the most misunderstood term in the overall interpretation of Zanzotto's work. Nevertheless, it may still offer a wealth of hermeneutical perspective. Landscape surely awaits for a new multipurpose geographical interpretation. Within the interpretation of Zanzotto's work, one perceives a general need to place the geographical paradigm ahead to the literary paradigm. In other words, there is a necessity to position theory of ecological perception above a theory of an aesthetic representation, because what one gets from the reading of Zanzotto writings is an aesthetic repercussion, that is to say, translation performed through devices, of an intuition perception of landscape. For the perspective, it will be possible to primarily focus the attention on places and not on time, as the aesthetic devices employed by the poet always lead to realm of places. In this regard, even when considering the spatial distribution of Zanzotto corpus of poetic works, it would be more suitable to use the term triptychs rather than trilogies, in order to underline that the aesthetic device avails of sensory dimension in the purpose of translating the two-way relationship between landscape and subject. The first section of this analysis of the term landscape starts with the still valid acquisition of the critical epistemological vision of landscape by Humboldt, showing that geographical subject, interdependent with landscape, correspond to the poetic subject of the first part of Zanzotto's poetic production. The investigation will then move to the analytical systemic vision typical of the industrial and post-industrial era. And here I will write about the Meschiari acquisition, which perfectly reflect in the loss of cognitive unity of the landscape, the crushing of the geographical subject from the beltà of words. On the one hand, this put technique in Zanzotto work under a new light. On the other, it accounts for the transformation of the poetic text.
Bene, Giovanna, quando vuoi, coi tuoi tempi, riprendi pure da dove ti torna meglio. Scusaci.
I was saying that we need to use a geographical paradigm instead of literary paradigm, because it's the first thing to use in Zanzotto, and I think now is really perception, only after representation. First one, and then before I told that I call triptychs the books Zanzotto wrote and now trilogies, because it as to say, when I say landscape, I imagine also a room or stanza in poetry. And I want to say, when I was in Pieve Soligo and I saw Le Crode di Pedre, it was very strange for me because it seems to me to be in a room. So it's very strange in a geological place so old. It's like a room for me. My perception was like to be in a room. So I restart in the first section of this analysis of term landscape starts with the still valid acquisition of the critical epistemological vision of landscape by Humboldt, showing that geographical subject interdependent with landscape correspond to the poetic subject of the first part of Zanzotto poetic production. Scusate, sto cercando di spegnere il telefono, non ci riesco. Bene, mi sembra che la giornata sia fantastica. C'è anche il gatto nero che girava. Comunque. The investigation will then move to an analytical-systemic version, typical of industrial and post-industrial era, which perfectly reflect in the loss of cognitive unity of the landscape, the crush of geographical subjects from the beltà on words. On the one hand, this puts technique in Zanzotto work under a new light. In the other, it accounts for the transformation of the poetic text and of the book itself into a map of the places of personal historical trauma, the contaminated landscape in Pollack, especially in galateo and bosco. The second section, based on eco-criticism and on recent Italian hermeneutical inquiry, which examines literary works through the lens of the relationship between man, king, and environment, develops around the concept of ecological intelligence and mind landscape here in Meschiari. In the attempt on the diachronically trace the element that express the consent of human innate cognitive measures in Zanzotto textuality, as well as the variant of the reading that each society makes in its ecological system, identifying the imagery expressed by Zanzotto landscape up to conglomerati. For reason of time, in this contribution, I will focus my attention on the start and the end of Zanzotto poetry, not surprising, in an attempt to create a framework effect hanging around the concept of landscape. When dealing with the idea of geographical subject, I will trace the general lines of correspondence with the first triptych of Zanzotto poetry. As a concept of ecological intelligence, I will share my insight in the final triptych of Zanzotto poetry. Both aspects can be better understood by taking into account what Zanzotto said in the video interview ritratti by Marco Paolini and Carlo Mazzacurati, in which still carries central relevance despite the passing of time. We, at first, are a species of movable center. We move with ourselves by recentering horizon and limits. Then, as soon as our seismic history accumulates, we realize that we are perpetually hidden behind the landscape, or in front of it, or plugged into the continuous place of stitching. A landscape conceived as something that stitches and sews, and in which we are a sort of spool that wander in the middle, that sew, and something that cuts. Therefore, as soon as our physical history accumulates, we store it in this landscape, which originally has its own authority and which later will come the ones that we flick unto it. Close. This statement is paramount if we think that the principle at the base of a possible ecological geographic paradigm is indeed a principle of interrelation, meant at the two-way relationship between subject and landscape, as pointed out by the scholar Ugo Morelli in Mente e Paesaggio. The landscape is within us before being around us. We create in the world where we live the landscape that we have in our mind, starting from the configuration of a childhood mind and from the building of its sense of belonging. The landscape is the first image of the world, after the familiar faces that each one of us built us. As among us humans, the world is a bridge between the horizon of reality and the horizon of the mind. In like manner, the landscape presides over our co-evolution and our circular bond with the world. For this very same reason, the landscape is at once within us and around us. It is a merging of connection between an inner world and the external world, close. In this respect, the aesthetic that Zanzotto poetry establishes is mobile and ever developing, because it offers stories and visibility which are acknowledgement of a space of life. Essentially, Zanzotto's poetry does not offer a landscape, but a range of landscapes, meant as the product of the subject poet positioning in relation of the oikos in which it belongs. And this act is of positioning mainly express themselves in enactment, which is the process of meaning, of acting and linguistic science, whereby the subject poet creates himself when he builds the world where he lives. Thus, the landscape that emerged from first triptych of work, especially in Dietro paesaggio vocativo, is undoubtedly an aesthetic place, namely a device that appears as a garden hortus. And beside, it is Zanzotto himself who states that landscape as a guise of incanto e gabbia, hinting at the Heaven Thames fresco that the poet's father painted in his bedroom when he was a child. All the natural elements acquire an emblematic connotation, and while reading, it is not difficult to picture in one's mind one of those medieval miniatures that represent a place of ideal life, hence an hortus conclusus. Nevertheless, the insight that Zanzotto offers is more complex if one considers that what Rosario Assunto theorized years ago, namely that the garden acquires the meaning of absolute landscape, whole congruity between idea and reality. According to that, Zanzotto's first poetic work states itself as ideal tension between that landscape, indeed as widespread form, and the garden, meant as crystallization of that form. This confirms, once again, the geographical centrality, the concept of place topos as in Zanzotto words. Accordingly, within the tension between landscape and garden, it is furthermore possible to perceive the shaping of dialectal oscillation between open and closed, non-property belonging, natural and artificial, multiplicity of viewpoints and their standardization. As to the last Zanzotto's production, that is to say the triptych that sees in its center some impressioni e conglomerati, which one attains after passing through the misleading place whose cornerstone is represented by beltà, and after the cartographic place which has galateo and bosco in its heart, several references of geological dimension have been made in relation to the poetry, this poetry, and to the megatime that would be connected to it. Considering that one should rather talk about a megaplace, name something that is totally out of scale compared to human, the most urgent matter is to frame within the right interpretation the geological device that is predominant in these works, expressly the distancing, which translates itself in the aesthetic device of ecological dystopia. Never before in this work has one been able to witness the representation of ecological disasters that have been caused by man up until the exploration of genetics straight into the guts of the life itself. But most importantly, once again, it is crucial to understand the reason of that distancing. They are not necessarily associated to a passive acknowledgement of degradation and to the crisis of nature directly caused by the man, but to the necessity to repositioning oneself in this destroyed natural world in order to allow the deterioration of man in an environment because it is in its core that the oikos, the common home, lies. In this respect, attaching whichever terms related to the concept of anthropocene to the last Zanzotto's production is not an accurate operation, because this could instantly lead to interpretation in opposite direction to the one proposed by Zanzotto. To the same degree, it is not accurate to sketch out a conservative portrait of the poet up to point of depicting him as a nostalgic of a long-gone beauty of an ancient landscape of Veneto. The interest of Zanzotto's poetry undeniably lies on present life, no matter what form it takes. Thank you.